Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Jackie Orr with NASCAST. I also have Jarl Crocker here with me, and he's going to be the other presenter for our webinar this afternoon. And again, thank you for joining us. I wanted to do a few housekeeping items first. So the first thing is you on our end, you are unmuted. So that means that we ask you to mute yourselves on your end so we don't get any feedback from you or any unwanted noise. So make sure that you mute yourselves. Now, of course, at any point in time, if you have a question, feel free to ask your question. We do have pauses throughout the webinar where we are, we'll ask you for some feedback at that time. But if ever you have a question, just ask it. And or you can also send your question or your comment through the chat window. And Jarl and I are going to be watching the chat window, so we'll be able to respond to your questions that way as well. And so Jarl is the person who's moving our slides along. So Jarl, why don't we move to the next slide?
Looks like we've got at least one person who's having some audio trouble. So if you have any issues hearing us, I know Jackie is on her cell phone. So if you're having any trouble, just send a message or a chat message to Muska, and she can hopefully help you resolve that issue.
I see Michelle saying that she can't hear. So that would just be Michelle, because I think if you can't hear me, that's good, Jarl. If you can't hear any of us at any point in time, let us know. Because I am on my cell phone. I've been having problems with my internet, and my work phone is connected to the internet, so this was the best alternative. But if at any point in time you can't hear us, so let us know, and Muska is here and available to help you out. Okay, so with that being said, let's get on to our agenda because we do have only an hour and a half and we want to get through as much as all of it as we possibly can. So the agenda, the way we've set it up is we're going to be walking through just in standards, certainly not all of them because we don't have the availability of time to do that, but those that we feel require more interpretation, or maybe you've had challenges with documentation. Some of these standards that Jarl and I are going to be talking about are standards that were mentioned on the CSBG manager regional calls last week that held, and just other times in conversation with state offices that we've heard that you have problems, or there are certain standards that you have more challenges with. So those are the ones we're going to be walking through. I believe there's 18 of them. And the way the presentation is organized is we are going to go through, like I said, a specific standard, talk about interpretation, guidance, and then the documentation. And then there's going to be an opportunity for all of you to talk and to have an open discussion on what's been working well in your state offices related to those particular standards, and if there's just anything that you want to share or any challenges. And throughout the presentation, we have tools and resources from the partnership and NASCAST that relate to the standards. And then at the very end of the presentation, which we will have up on the NASCAST website when we finish the webinar series, will include a bunch of resources at the end of the webinar, which we most likely will get to today, but they're there as a resource for all of you. Okay, Jarl, we can move on. Okay, Michelle says, I called in and can hear you now. Perfect, wonderful. Okay, so the purpose the purpose of the organizational standards, I think I'm turning this over to you, Jarl, correct?
No, I think you take this, and I'll take the next one.
Sorry, we're moving back and forth with each other. Okay, so as you all know, the purpose of the standards, again, as a response to threatened cuts in funding. Those of you who've been with us for a while may remember Obama's State of the Union, where he talked about being willing to cut programs that he cared deeply about, and one of those he mentioned was community action, and that was the beginning of our performance management framework, which includes the organizational standards, enrollment next generation, as you well know, both state and federal accountability measures as well. The standards are definitely an early warning system for deeper problems within a community action agency. So we've always talked about them being sort of the floor or being a minimum. So we know that if agencies are struggling or having challenges with meeting these standards, then may well be an early warning that there might be something else deeper that the agency is struggling with. We also know that the same standards are a framework for improving management, operations, and outcomes. And I mentioned this on our last call that when Jarl and the partnership and NASCAS and myself, when we did that survey about organizational standards, the agencies and for the network or for the state offices, and it was pretty loud and clear that both the state offices and the community action agencies really felt that the standards have really helped the network improve management, operations, and outcomes. Okay, so moving on, I just wanted to bring to your attention these next two slides. IM 138, which I'm sure you probably are all aware of. If you're not, you might want to refresh yourself and take a look at it. IM 138 is really the guidance that provides guidance specifically, I guess, for state offices about their oversight with the organizational standards and their charge to make sure that agencies are complying with the standards. And IM 138 goes into more detail in the next slide about how the states can do that. And there's ways, of course, that the state does the assessment of the standards, and what you may do in your state may look different to what happens in another state. And IM 138, what also it talked about, which we will discuss before, is that and talk about, it references that agencies need time to meet all the standards, but that they should be progressing towards meeting the standards, and it specifically draws out and mentions the community needs, or not the community needs, the strategic plan, and that agencies may be needing to take some time to progress to meet some of those standards that may take them a little bit longer. So with that, I think, Jarl, now I am going to turn it over to you, and Jarl is going to talk about the interpretation and documentation.
Jackie, and so just a couple of big picture items to review at the very top, of course, just to reiterate that state offices have the ultimate authority for the interpretation and documentation of the standards, and this is both, I think in some ways a good thing and in some ways a challenge. It's good because obviously it allows for state flexibility in how all of your state offices work with the standards. Obviously, the challenge is that there is that flexibility, and so there is no one national, set of rules and guides when it comes to interpretation and documentation. So, we'll still occasionally get that question from a state office about, who has that ultimate authority. So we just want to make sure that we're clear on that. And also, I think this is another important point. Both the partnership, NASCAS, other national partners like CAPLA have published guidance on the standards. So, for example, our technical assistance guides, we know many state offices have defaulted in some cases to sort of using the guidance from those sources, and the challenge is there is, a little bit of variance even within the documents, for example, that the partnership has published. So just a reminder that if you are sending agencies to things like our technical assistance guides, it's always helpful to make sure that, you do a review, because sometimes, there is just a little bit of inconsistency between different versions. And so, again, I want to stress the importance of making sure that state offices are just providing, that clear and detailed guidance on how you're interpreting the standards and what your documentation requirements are, because there's no way to do that at a national level, since that responsibility lies at the state level. Next, the standards, as Jackie said, are the ground floor or minimum requirements for management and operations. As she said, they're really meant as that early warning system. And so I think it's it's good to keep in mind, and again, this is just my general guidance, the partnership's general guidance, is that I think we do hear sometimes when we get feedback from our agencies out in the field, sort of the concern that sometimes they feel like they're being held to best practices rather than sort of more ground floor basic standards, like we were just saying. And so my general guidance is to look for opportunities to use training and technical assistance to build the capacity of your agency. So again, I hear this too when I work with state offices. A common question is, what happens if somebody gives us a bad needs assessment and it sort of meets the letter of the law with the standards, but we don't think it's particularly good. And I know that's a challenging situation, but I think what that shows actually is that the standards are working. The agency has met the minimum requirements, but now that we've got some clear standards, that's flagged for you that they might need a little additional help in doing their next needs assessment or maybe doing some fill-in work. And so that's part of the challenge of the standards. There's some that I think should be interpreted very strictly because they relate to things that are, for example, requirements of the CSBG Act, like the composition of an agency's tripartite board. But for others, for example, recording the number of hours worked by volunteers, there's a little bit more wiggle room and leeway in terms of how you want to document that and what you're looking for from your agency. So I just think a good rule of thumb is to use training and technical assistance as a follow-up to the standards if there are concerns about, agencies, having some challenges or difficulties if they're sort of sneaking in under the wire, as it were, in terms of meeting the letter of the law, but you really want them to take the next step or get to the next level. So that's when training and technical assistance comes in. So I know it is, a matter of judgment in some cases about where to set that bar, but I think that's just a general good rule of thumb. And as the slide says, just consider the intent of the standard. So, an agency that's having trouble recording its volunteer hours, isn't necessarily an agency that's in trouble. Maybe they just need to get a little bit more organized. On the flip side, if you see an agency that's not doing payroll reporting the way it should be, it's not reporting that on time, then that's a much more significant issue because it can have a significant effect on the agency. So I think there is that's one of the tricks of the standard is just exercising that judgment and figuring out which standards are ones to be more strict on because they are legal requirements or may indicate a significant issue, and where you might want to have a little bit more leeway or flexibility because they're more good practices, but they don't necessarily raise a red flag about the agency's management and operations. And then again, that last bullet, just to reiterate, the partnership and NASCAP TNTA resources are intended to supplement state office guidance. So, again, it's perfectly okay to direct your agencies to those resources. Just make sure that you're being clear with them. And of course, Jackie and I are always available to provide any additional guidance or any support. But I think at this point we have a number of resources that are floating out there, and it's not like we made sure that everything was completely internally consistent. So occasionally we'll get agency questions when they're reading different things depending on what source or even what date a particular set of guidance was released. So next, just some suggested monitoring practices. Again, we just encourage our state offices to use a system that allows for clear and practical submission and updating of documentation. I know a number of state offices these days use online systems. We generally have gotten really good feedback both from state offices and from agencies about those systems. It makes the upload and management of documents a little bit more efficient and easy to work with. But if you are in a state where there's maybe a budgetary challenge in getting an online system, again, just make sure you're working with your agencies to identify ways to make that process as effective and efficient as possible, just to make sure that it's not as much of a reporting burden, both on the agencies and also the state office. Next, another suggestion is to provide agencies with time to submit or update documentation. So I know that different states have different reporting schedules, but generally, if it is possible to provide, at least some window, whether it's a couple weeks or ideally a month or two, between when you do your monitoring and when you finally report those finalized results to OCS. That's just helpful in case an agency, is able to put together some additional documentation or fill in some missing gaps. And I think just that added flexibility is good both for state offices and for our agencies, because it does give an agency some time to react and hopefully address issues that are identified during monitoring. If there was questions about the interpretation of the standard or maybe some lack of clarity on their part about the documentation. So providing that grace period, I think, is really helpful. And again, we've gotten good feedback from both agencies and state offices that use that particular approach about its effectiveness. Also, just another suggestion, if you can develop guides with lists of required documentation, just as clearly as possible, list out what you're looking for. I think most state offices at this point have those lists. But again, documentation is one thing where, high levels of clarity are really helpful to the agencies because it lays out specifically what you're looking for and allows them to make sure they're assembling those documents as early as possible in the monitoring process. We've seen a number of state offices put together online or other versions of frequently asked questions. So there's an ongoing record, of common issues that agencies might have with particular standards. And so, that helps state offices, so you're not always answering the same questions over and over. You can guide your agencies, to your FAQ page or your FAQ document, and it also allows for there, to be a little discussion, a little bit more explanation, that also happens as part of a forum that's available to all the agencies in your state. So, again, we know some state offices like Texas, TDHCA, has an FAQ page on their website, and we're, I'm sure Jackie is more than willing to point you in the direction of some of the resources developed by state offices to help answer some of those questions. And then lastly, I know again this is something that many state offices are now doing as a matter of course, but just holding regular calls to discuss interpretation and documentation issues with the standards, or otherwise making sure that there's some kind of routine forum, whether it's a meeting at your annual conference, like I said, a quarterly conference call or a call every 6 months to check in with the agencies. Providing that opportunity for that back and forth and give and take really helps make sure that everybody's on the same page, that there are high levels of clarity, and that you can address any issues that might come up before the monitoring process occurs. So next, this is just a quick summary of the different thematic groups of the standards. So as Jackie said, we'll go through 1 or 2 standards per category, ones that have been flagged for us as sometimes raising some questions about documentation or interpretation, or standards that sort of raise issues across other categories in terms of how they're worded, like standards that deal with process or board reporting, since there are a number of standards that involve those types of issues. Jackie, I'll take standard 1.1, and then I'll turn it over to you for the next one.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, I think standard 1.1, the organization or department demonstrates low-income individuals' participation in its activities. And so just for efficiency, when there's high levels of similarity between the nonprofit and the public agency standard, we've just combined them. So I think that this is a good example of one of those more broadly written standards that might raise some issues around interpretation, because it asks for a definition of what does participate mean and what does activities mean. And so, again, in terms of interpretation, making sure that you're participation, making sure that you're giving clear guidance to your agencies about what that entails. So, obviously, it would include things like participation on the board, participation in the needs assessment and strategic planning processes. So laying out what would count as participation and then letting agencies sort of fill in where they feel like they meet that standard. I think it is just generally good practice. So the more guidance you can give about what your state office counts would be activities and participation, I think is very helpful. And then this is also a standard that raises a common question with some of these broader standards, which is how much is enough. So for example, if the agency was able to show obviously that low-income individuals participated on their board, and that they had participated in the needs assessment and strategic planning processes, would that be enough to meet this particular standard? So, again, making sure there's clear messaging about what that minimum threshold is. I think, using things like templates that let agencies plug in what kind of activities that they're using to meet that standards and meet the standard, and what constitutes participation. I think is helpful to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So obviously the same thing for documentation. This is, again, one of those standards that raises the question, how much documentation are you looking for? So, if you're asking the agency to document every single last time a person with low-income individuals participated in their activities, that could be incredibly burdensome, both to the agency and, of course, to the monitor and the state office. So, I think our guidance here generally is maybe for some of these broader standards to ask agencies for a narrative description of what they're doing, and then maybe appending 3 or 4 documents for some of the more intensive activities that involve more people, just to show that they're recording that they can back that up, but not asking for documentation for every single last activity. So I'm personally a big fan of the spot check rather than the comprehensive documentation requirement. But again, that's just my suggestion, and so I think those are the types of issues to make sure you've got a dialogue with your agency and you're messaging clearly in terms of your expectations of what you're looking for. So Jackie, I'll turn it over to you for 1.3.
Okay.
Questions from folks.
Okay, yes, great. Thank you, Jarl. And yes, what we will do is after 1.3, those are the 2 that we're covering in Category 1, so then we'll pause for any questions that you might have. Okay, so point 3 is the organization has a systematic approach for collecting, analyzing, and reporting customer satisfaction data to the governing board. And what you see in the brackets is for specifically for public agencies. So that says which may be met through broader local government processes. So like the one that the standard that Jarl was just talking about that was broad, this has many different components. And I think one of the challenges with this standard is making sure that that the agencies respond to all the pieces, because when you look at it and you can see the parts that are underlined, we're looking at systematic approach, and we have to look at collecting data, analyzing data, and reporting data. So let's move to let's move to the next slide, Charles. So when we're looking at interpretation and we're looking at that first piece, which is the Cystic Approach, so we have to find the information, and the agency has to provide information on how does that happen. So how does the collection of the customer satisfaction data happen across programs? How many programs collect the data? At what points are the data collected? We have to look at methods of collection. Is it surveys? Is it focus groups? The tools that are used for the data collection, the structure that supports the data analysis, and of course, what is the process for reporting. So there's lots of pieces that need to be integrated into looking at that systemic approach. So move to the next slide. This is one of those, so when you think about systemic approach, it's very similar to those other standards that talk about process. So when you think about systemic approach or process, then the agency needs to be able to have some documentation, some policies and procedures that document how they collect customer satisfaction data. So what is that process? So that's the first piece of documentation that they need to be able to share. So it's not necessarily just all of the separate components, but what is their process, what is their procedure, what is their policies that they have for that. And then, how do they collect the data? What are they using to collect the data? And then, nope, Jarl, I was moving on to you. And then the next piece is what are they using to analyze the data? So their policies and procedures. So how is that data that they're collecting from their customers analyzed? And then lastly, what is reported to the board, because it has to be reported to the governing board, and how is it reported? And there's examples here. It could be written reports, it could be scorecards, and then lastly, we have to have board minutes indicating that the information was actually shared with the board. And I think this goes a long way to what Jarl was talking about with, providing that maybe that extra training and assistance agencies, because perhaps some of your agencies didn't collect customer satisfaction data before the standards. So this is something that's new. So they're implementing new policies and procedures and new ways of doing this and having to share with the board. So it might be something that, they may collect data, customer satisfaction data once a year. So that's the question, is that enough? Should they do it more? So that can be one of those things that you work on as a state office, and that additional training and technical assistance. I know many state offices do a lot of not so much reviews, but sharing. So if there's an agency that you figure that, really hit this out of the park and does a fabulous job, and it might be something they might have some examples and some approaches that can be shared with other agencies. Okay. Now we're pausing. So those are the two that are in category 1. So does anybody have any questions or anything that you want to share that you think has worked well in your state office, particularly around those two standards?
This is Deetsa from Massachusetts.
Hi.
So this is regarding 1.3, and we have private nonprofits. One of the things is that what we get often are the tools around the collecting, analyzing, and reporting out. But I think what we're seeing at times is the first piece, which is this a systematic approach, which is what is your narrative summary? How are you going about it? So, I think what we find is that we'll get the tools used, but there's nothing that says, well, how do you use it, when, what's the process? And I think that's the piece that has been somewhat of a back and forth with agencies, because it's asking for the systematic approach, and then, you're able to substantiate the tools. So the tools without some kind of methodology of what you're doing with it, it seems to me does not, if you don't have the methodology and you're only providing the tools, it's not meeting the standard. Am I correct?
Again, Deetsa, I think that's one of those questions of judgment, because I think if there's no evidence that they're actually doing anything with the data, then I would tend to say that would be more problematic for the agency in terms of meeting the standard. If it looks like they're analyzing some of the data some of the time, I think that might be a situation where you would tell an agency that, we'll give you, a pass this year, but next year we're going to be looking for, a higher level of clarity, and then maybe see if there's a way to get them some additional TNTA. or at least, sort of outline them where they were, sort of where their response was problematic.
I think I agree with that, Jarl, what you said too, but I think that your very valid point there is that, the pieces might be there, but I think that there needs to be something that you would see that the agency would say, this is our process. Like another standard, what's our process for doing board orientation? So this is our process for doing customer satisfaction data. This is how we collect it. This is the procedure. So this is our collection method. This is how we analyze this is how we analyze it, and then this is how we report it to the board, so that you can see what the whole system approach is, and then you can see the specific pieces that fit into that approach.
Correct, and to just, and how we interpret it, because, for example, we have some agencies that, without having this kind of process, we would have never known that, well, they really only did it during the community needs once every 3 years, which I think it needs to be more, but where this doesn't have any definitive way, I just felt like, well, the intent is that you are engaging for customer feedback, and if all we get in the minutes is that we presented a report to the board on customer satisfaction with no backup, no nothing, we've interpreted that in addition to the tools, we need to know, well, what's your timeline, what's the kickoff, and then it makes it a more appropriate that the tools are being utilized. So that's why whenever I think there are one or two other instances where the organizational standards talk about approach, a systematic approach, where to us we've interpreted as that, well, you've got to be able to kind of summarize. You can have the tools, but without knowing what you do with those tools, you can't mesh the two together.
Right, like Category 9 with data collection, I think that's a similarly worded couple standards there. Yeah. And again, this is one of those judgment calls. If their system is that every program collects customer satisfaction data once a year, and there are different people that are looking at it. Maybe it's happening at a program level, and then they kick some numbers upstairs to report to the board. That's not an ideal system, but at least they have some of the basics in place. So again, that would be a judgment call, as long as you're clearly communicating to the agencies how you're interpreting that standard. I think that's the most important thing, what you're looking, to them to be able to tell you, because if there's just basically a big hunk of the standard that's missing, if they're doing a decent job of collecting that data, but it's like I said, it's clear they're just not doing anything with it, that would be more problematic for me.
Exactly. Okay.
Yep. All right. Great. Anything else before we move on? Okay, so Jarl, I think you can, if you think of something, just chime in, but I think Jarl is now going to talk about 2.2.
Yep, Standard 2.2 reads, the organization utilizes information gathered from key sectors of the community, assessing needs and resources during the community assessment process or at other times. These sectors would include, at a minimum, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, private sector, public sector, and educational institutions. So, I think this is another example of one of those more broadly worded questions. It does have that "or" in there. So, again, it's setting that minimum bar that this data collection happens at least every 3 years. But obviously, you'd want to see that happen a little bit more. And that does establish sort of the minimum baseline. And in terms of interpretation, I think the standard is clear in laying out which sectors that data needs to come from. But again, it raises that question of how much is enough. So, let's say the agency talked to one other organization once a year in each of those sectors. Again, that would be a case of them maybe just nosing right under the bar, as it were, but making sure that you're clear with them about what you're looking for, in terms of the number and frequency of that contact with different sectors. I think it's just something that's important to clarify. Now, of course, most agencies, I think, as a matter of course, are going to have strong partnerships. But there may be a situation where maybe the agency just simply hasn't connected with one of those sectors, and they aren't able to show you that evidence. So that raises another question for interpretation. What if they're doing really good in every sector except one, and they just can't document that connection? So again, just making clear what you would do in that particular case. I think that's another great instance of where having that grace period would be helpful. So, if the agency just has no connection whatsoever to the business community, giving them a month or two to do some outreach and to be able to show that, they at least had a conference call or two or set up a meeting, would give them that flexibility. And in terms of documentation, again, just like Standard 1.1, I think this is a standard where, it's more problematic to ask for documentation for every single last contact. This would be another place to use a spot check where you might ask for a narrative, list, 3 or 4 organizations that you partner with to gather information, and then maybe, give one example in each of those sectors. So you're sort of spot checking that documentation. And also, this would be a time where you could tell the agency it's okay to cross-reference that list of partnerships that's called for in another standard, just to make it a little bit more efficient. So I think this is, again, one of those standards that's similar in 1.1, so just making sure that you're clear on expectations for what happens in those cases at the margin. If there's one sector that's missing, how much contact or data collection that you're looking for, and again, just making sure that you've had discussions with your agencies about what's reasonable in terms of how much documentation to provide. And Mackie, I think that's everything for Category 2.
Yeah, right, it is.
Question, is this webinar open to the entire network? And what we've done is broken it up into time zones. We actually wanted smaller groups on, so we could have some give and take with folks, and so it's open to all of the state offices because we wanted specifically, to talk with the monitors and other folks at the state offices to just give you all a chance to, have some conversation with each other and with us, about some of these issues around documentation and interpretation. So as far as I know, it's just Jackie and I, and then folks from the state offices who've called in.
And that's true, Jarl. And what we did is we had everyone do pre-registration so we could ensure that it was specifically for state office staff because it's more relevant, and we wanted the conversation to be, made more sense with state offices, those state office staff on these calls. Anybody have anything they want to add?
Yeah, Lisa, again, I feel like I must be the only one on the call, but I do think that and this is great. I appreciate it, but at some point, it's good to be able to somehow maybe engage the two entities, being the monitors to the network that we're monitoring, because there's, I think, some enhanced value in hearing this kind of information, especially about some of the interesting ways of interpretation or what should be done, because we've gotten into some, and I don't know if with other states, we've gotten into some back and forth, and I don't know if it speaks to the overall language basis. We've had lawyers tear things down and build it back up, and so I just, at some point, I don't know at what point we could engage where both sides kind of flushing through some of these more interesting organizational standards that might require some of this kind of dialogue.
And Dita, we're always happy to phone in on conference calls that you might have, just sort of offer our good offices to sort of help talk through some of these issues of interpretation and documentation. We try to make space for these kinds of discussions at a national conference, so we're going to have a panel discussion on how things are going with the organizational standards coming up in Denver with OCS and NASCASP in the room. So we're trying to build in those opportunities, but I really think because the state does have the flexibility to interpret the standards, it's hard to do this above a state level. I know I've had some discussions on RPIC calls, for example, where we had state offices and state associations just talk about how things are going. But I think, making sure, like I said, there are those opportunities, whether it's a conference call or a time at a state conference, to come together and basically have a negotiation about some of these issues, or at least a discussion about them. Is the best way to go. And both Jackie and I are always happy to do whatever we can to help make those things happen. And of course, we do have webinars for our network. We had previously the Center of Excellence went through all 9 categories. Those are available on our website. So I think we're trying to make sure there's some consistent messaging. But we're here to help with whatever you need. So just let us know.
Yeah, and I am aware. I've participated, both from the webinars. Unfortunately, I don't think we all as a network are able to attend each other's conferences at times because of whatever, whether it's bus or travel restrictions. So webinars seem to be the more active opportunity to get everybody online, but I appreciate, and we may have one that we will probably be following up with NASCASP on, and probably depending on what how that goes, bring Community Action Partnership and CAP Law in on. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dita. And I agree with Jarl. I think those are good conversations to have more at the state level. So, all right, perfect. So let's move on to standard 3.3. So this is for those that are in Category 3 with the Community Needs Assessment. So we just pulled this one specifically. The organization collects and analyzes both qualitative and quantitative data on its geographic service area or areas in the community assessment. So that looks at quantitative, collects, and analyzes. So here you need the agency would have to show that they've collected both kinds. So we know that quantitative is the numbers, so that can be from census, their own individual program information, demographic information, Department of Labor, Department of Education, other resources like that. And the qualitative is the opinions, observations, and other descriptive information. And often this is gets gathered through focus groups, interviews, community forums, and as well as surveys. So that's the qualitative and quantitative piece. I think we could get into that discussion that Jarl had earlier with, what is enough, and I think we kind of have gotten good at getting enough of the quantitative data. I know lots of agencies use Community Commons, which is a pretty robust tool and provides lots of information. And then maybe the question is qualitative data, is one focus group enough? Is, doing one survey enough? And I think that's where, you as the state office would have to set your expectations and talk to your network about that. The other piece is analyzing. So the documentation on data analysis is also required to meet the standard. And that would include data analysis procedures, description of the processes and methods used to analyze the data. So who did it, how was it done, and what does that look like? So you want to be able to see what that method was, how they analyzed it, what the methods they used in the documentation. So if you go to the next slide, you can see for the documentation pieces that you obviously are looking at the community assessment and backup documentation, and also that you could have committee or team meeting minutes that reflect the analysis, and also the method section. So that could explain what method the agency used when they were looking at analyzing the data. All right, we got there. I thought it was my computer that was low. That's all right. Thank you, Charles. All right. So any questions about that standard or anything in community needs assessment? And while thinking, we want to move along, Charles, just so we can show some of the resources, because this is the place we dumped in the resources. Remember to mute yourself. I wanted to let everyone know that, too. I heard some noise before, so please mute yourself on your end. This is the Community Commons Needs Assessment tool that I referenced before. We know lots of agencies use this. This is just another screenshot of that tool, and these are available on the partnership website. This is a tool from ASCAS about doing a comprehensive community needs assessment that's on ASCAS website. And last but certainly not least is the checklist for monitoring community needs assessments specifically for state office staff. And one of the other things I did want to mention that I know a lot of states have helped agencies in this area just doing a community needs assessment and the causes and conditions of poverty, and the analyzing data by creating, standardized surveys, by creating guidelines for community needs assessments, by creating templates, and all that has really helped the agencies not only do community needs assessment in and of themselves, but certainly help respond to the organizational standards. And
yeah, we had a question that came in for Standard 3.1. How do you determine if an agency has issued a report to the community? And that's a great question, because again, I think it's one of those sort of threshold questions. So for example, if an agency puts its needs assessment on its website and says it's there for the community to see, does that count as issuing a report? And so, for me, that would be one of those things on, that's sort of on the line, because ideally what you want to see, is at least that the agency has, sent an email to some of its partners and key stakeholders saying, here's our needs assessment. For me, that would be more of the intent of the standard. So I think, again, that speaks to the importance of, making sure that, if you as a state office decide putting something up on the website just doesn't cut it, you're clearly communicating to the agency that, that's not enough. The sort of passive posting of information doesn't count as issuing a report. At a minimum, they need to send out an email, hold a meeting, something that's more active in getting the word out. And when I do trainings on the needs assessment, I always say this is one of the most important things you can do, because your needs assessment is one of the best marketing, community awareness, and engagement tools that we have as community action agencies. But that said, that is up to the state office to determine what actually constitutes issuing a report. And I think setting that minimum guideline, that the agency would need to be able to show that they had sent out, the report to, at least, some key stakeholders, would be what would get them in, under the line, and ideally they'd be doing a little bit more than that in terms of getting the word out. So, I know that's not a sort of a black and white answer to your question, but again, that is both the benefit and the challenge of the standards, that it's left up to the state office to set what that threshold is.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jarl. And I just wanted someone else that asked a question. Is there a list of state contacts that do organizational standards so we can contact one another? So on the NASCAS website, there is, it says contact. There are state contacts across the country as well as the territories. There's a primary and a secondary contact person. They may not be the specific person in the office that does organizational standards or does the assessment of organizational standards. But Steve, I think you can go there and contact, like, say, Dietza in Massachusetts, and if Dietza is not the person who does the assessment of the standards, then she could certainly let you know who in her office does. And if you have any questions or you want more information, then you can always reach out to me. Jarl, let's move on to Standard 4.3.
So this is the dreaded Roma standard, which reads and so this is one when we surveyed state offices and agencies and state associations. This was one of the ones at the top of the list that was most challenging. So let's try to demystify this one a little bit. So it reads that the organization's community action plan and strategic plan document the continuous use of the full results of the Roma cycle, comparable system, assessment, planning, implementation, achievement of results, and evaluation. In addition, the organization documents having used the services of a Roma certified trainer or equivalent to assist in implementation. So, this is a little bit of a wordy standard. But in terms of interpretation, what it's calling for is that the agency, again, has simply, consulted a Roma trainer or Roma implementer to review how they've done their community action plan and their strategic plan, and that they are looking at that full Roma cycle. So, a common question that I get on 4.3 is, well, we've done our strategic plan, but we haven't implemented it. So how can we show that we've used the full Roma cycle? And so the standard is asking is simply that the agency has looked at all 5 stages of the Roma cycle and that their strategic plan, has a plan in place for doing implementation and evaluation and then reporting that back in so they can sort of continue to develop their strategic plan. It doesn't mean that they've actually done all stages of the Roma cycle. And again, the consulting using the services of a certified Roma trainer, simply means that there's been a thoughtful conversation or review done by the Roma trainer of these 2 processes. So it doesn't mean that the Roma trainer is involved from beginning to end, but just at some point that the agency has talked to the Roma trainer, either asked them to review their process or documentation and provide them with feedback. So I think in reality, there's sometimes a tendency to sort of overread in terms of the interpretation what this particular standard is asking for. So, I think, again, making sure that you're clear with your agencies that it just simply means a Roma trainer or implementer or equivalent has discussed or provided feedback to the agency about their CAP plan and their strategic plan to make sure that they're looking, sort of throughout the Roma cycle. And the partnership provides, just to fast forward to documentation, the partnership does provide that template documenting standard 4.3 that just lays it out, makes it very easy for the Roma trainer to indicate, what they noted, summarize any feedback that they've given. It just lays out the community plan and the strategic plan there. So it's relatively straightforward. So, we really think this template makes it easy to document how 4.3 has been complied with. And of course the other challenge is sometimes that a Roma trainer or implementer isn't available. And so, I think sort of that speaks to the importance of, first of all, making sure that the state office and state association are supporting the development of Roma trainers. So, looking at the number of Roma trainers in your state network and encouraging agencies to send folks to that training, and also seeing if there's the opportunity for the state office and state association to use some of those TNTA resources to support some of those trainers going through the process. But Jane, to add on that one?
No, other than I really like this form, and I share it all the time whenever I get asked. So I think it's useful, it's very easy, very straightforward.
All right, 4.5 to you.
Okay, So the organization has a written succession plan in place for the CED, approved by the governing board, which contains procedures for covering an emergency unplanned short-term absence of 3 months or less, as well as outlines the process for filling a permanent vacancy. That's for a private community action agency and public. The department adheres to its local government's policies and procedures around interim appointments and processes for filling a permanent vacancy. So for the interpretation for this standard, I think the most important thing is it really requires 3 pieces. So this is another one that's just more than one part. So you have to have a written succession plan, and it to be approved by the board, that the succession plan has to have evidence of emergency unplanned short-term absence for 2 months or less, and a process for filling a permanent vacancy. So it has to have those 2 pieces in order to fully comply with the standard. Our last call, someone had asked whether those needed to be 2 separate documents, and we said no, they don't need to be. It could be 1 document, but it certainly could be 2 separate documents. So you could have 1 document that has the procedures for the short-term absence, and you could have another document that has the process for filling a permanent vacancy. And then the board minutes, of course, indicating approval of the succession plan. And the last thing here you see on your slide is that public agencies need to adhere to the local government policies and procedures, whatever they are, they have to comply with around interim appointments and filling vacancies. And then these are just, we've dumped in some more information for you and to share with you agencies, or for yourself if you don't know that these tools are available or you want some more information about them. This is on the Connection Partnership website, and it's preparing for your community's action agency's future, sustainability, succession, and transition. And as you can see, there's 3 different guides, part 1, part 2, and part 3, and they actually include, if you go to the next slide, Jarl, and I was looking at them the other day recently, so you can see that there's an emergency backup succession plan template as well as a CEO succession policy template. So those are good templates for you to share with the agencies if your agencies are struggling in this area and they want something to start with, because I think we all know it's easier to have some starting point, because then the agency can, fill it in if that's what's the easiest for them, or then they can say, well, there's pieces of that we like and we can take, but there's other things that we need to include that make sense for our agency. So it's a good place to start. Oh, anybody have any questions? Or any? Just come in as you think of them along the way. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jarl for 5.1. Sure.
5.1 is the standard covering the tripartite board composition. So it reads, Standard 5.1, the organization's governing board is structured in compliance with the CSDG Act, at least 1/3 democratically selected representatives of the low-income community, 2 1/3 local elected officials or their representatives, and 3 membership from major groups and interests in the community. And I think, I think standard is relatively straightforward in at least some senses, because it's just right out of the CSDG Act saying the agency needs to comply with the tripartite board structure. However, you may have monitors that come from outside community action who aren't, as familiar with board composition issues. So, I think this standard just speaks to the importance of making sure are aware of resources, for example, like those on CapLaw's webpage that talks a little bit more about the tripartite board structure and gives, a little bit more additional guidance about what that means. And so, I think we will look at Standard 5.2 in a second, the democratic selection process, but this is an example of a standard that's a little bit more technical. So, for example, a question in terms of interpretation is, what does it mean that someone is democratically selected representative of the low-income community? And so democratic selection can mean a number of things. It can mean an open election. can also mean what Cap Law calls micro-democratic procedures, meaning that someone from another body that has been democratically selected, so for example, a local school board or a tenants council in a low-income area, then appoints one of their members to serve on the board. And because that body went through a democratic selection process, it's considered, that person is considered to have been, selected democratically. So you don't necessarily have to have open elections, but somebody who didn't have that background, might interpret that more strictly, that it needs to be, a service area-wide election process. By sort of that, in that same vein, what does it mean to be representative of the low-income community? As Cap Law clarifies, what that means is you have to be representative of the community. You don't have to be a person with low income yourself. You could, live in the community and be representative of the, sort of the general demographics of the community. You could live, or you could represent that community, say, because you're maybe a member of an advocacy organization that works with the low-income community in the agency's service area. So there are a number of sort of more technical issues with interpretation of 5.1. So just making sure that monitors are clear, that they know how to access those guidance documents, and that also your agencies are clear as well, because, I've done a lot of board training and I get questions on this all the time. So, I think especially with the turnover in the network that we're seeing, we're having people coming in from outside community action that haven't had this drilled into them or who might not be as familiar. So, I think messaging for monitors and also for your agencies is important in terms of interpretation. And here I think, documentation is relatively, straightforward to show compliance. It's the, the bylaws, the board member list, and the board minutes to show that they're in compliance. So, Jackie, 5.2.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jarl. And Jarl also already referenced some of this, but let's go through it. For nonprofits, the organization's governing board has written procedures that document a democratic selection process for low-income board members adequate to assure that they are representative of the low-income community. And then you can see that for the public nonprofits, the department board has written procedures that document a democratic selection process for low-income members, and then another mechanism specified by the state to assure decision-making and participation by low-income individuals. And that language in the development, planning, implementation, and evaluation of the program, so that's part of the statute. So when we go to the interpretation of Standard 5.2, it is grounded in the CSG Act, so it's not something that's new. And Jarl did talk already about that it is democratically selected, necessarily elected. So once a potential board member is selected, then of course that individual still needs to be elected and seated by the board of the agency, and that is done following whatever is in the agency's bylaws and board policies. And then you can see on the slide that there's information and a quote from IM 82 that speaks to that's really around the board, I guess, roles and responsibilities in a lot of ways. So it talks about the implicit intent of this requirement is to assure that those who currently live in areas served by the agency are represented, so they have a strong voice in agency governance and direction, and are able to convey to those they represent the presence and significance of community action in their lives. So that's really the reason, the intent that's part of the statute for community action and in one of our standards. And then the democratic selection it can include general elections. It can also include, Jarl already referenced before, the democratically selected from perhaps a parent-teacher association or a Head Start Policy Council as well. So I know many agencies do that, and that works well for them. I do want to give a plug for, and we did not include those slides in this part of the presentation. They might be at the end, but the CAP law has a couple wonderful, I think there's 3 or 4 case studies called Raising the Democratic Voice or something, but they're really good. They're from agencies, and they talk about the democratic selection process that those agencies use. So whenever I get questions around this, I refer the folks to those comments because I think they're really helpful. And documentation for this standard, you would want to see the written policy. That could be in the board policy procedure manual or bylaws or in the minutes. So there are ways to see this is documented with the agency.
Jackie, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. So first, a board that is set up as a tripartite board, including vacancies, is still considered a total board composition. Is that an accurate interpretation? So if I'm reading that question correctly, yes. So even if there are vacancies, you're looking, especially at the bylaws, I think is the key issue here, to make sure the bylaws spell out that tripartite composition, and the number of folks on the board should be divisible by 3, because you've got those requirements for at least 1/3 representation by people with low incomes.
That's my interpretation. No, I was going to say that's how I've interpreted that question too, Charles.
Yeah, and then second question for 5.2, if the agency includes all Democratic selections with no indication of preference, how should states perceive this? And so maybe could we get a little bit more clarification of what you're looking for in terms of all Democratic selections?
Yeah, this is Deetza. We have been presented in some of the CAA bylaws where they'll just list all the different ways it can, but they don't identify necessarily which way they typically go. So it leaves us having to say at any given point in time, well, how did you democratically select for this particular period? So they kind of cover everything, but don't say, well, we defer this first, and if this doesn't happen, then we go this way. And I think just stating all the different ways you can do it without a preference, it's kind of challenging, because it seems like you can switch it up year to year.
Well, I see what you're getting at. I think that would be fine if in the bylaws the agency, had just listed a number of different things that were okayed by their bylaws. What you'd want to be checking for, was that they were actually following that procedure for the low-income representatives. Right, because for me that would potentially be the disconnect if there are multiple options. So just maybe asking them, when they give you their board roster, to just list how those low-income representatives were selected, and hopefully they'd be able to supply that information.
They should. I guess it just. I sometimes think that it could get into a little bit of if. The representation, if it's not really clear, well, which way are you doing community elections? Are you going to certain low-income agencies? We typically try to push back and say, well, what's your, preferred method? And you can use some of the others, but, to have it open, it's just kind of like we present everything to you. And, on any given year, it could switch from one, way or another, which I guess, it's a matter of interpretation, I suppose.
Yeah, I know what CAP law would say to that, which would be, they would say, it's beneficial to give the agency some flexibility because, it can be a challenge to fill, those seats for the low-income reps. So, sort of allowing some different processes to be used, just sort of makes it easier for the agency to fill those seats. But, like I said, what I'd be looking for was whether they followed through on that process and could show you that they stuck with what their bylaws were saying.
Okay.
All right, so standard 5.7, this is an interesting one that we've gotten a number of questions about. The organization has a process to provide a structured orientation for governing board members within 6 months of being seated. And so I think this calls up two main issues in terms of interpretation. First of all, you want to make sure that there is actually a process. So ideally, that would be a written document. I think it would be a little bit challenging to keep to a process if it wasn't written down. But you want to make sure that there is that clear process in place for providing that structured board orientation, and that states that it happens within 6 months of being seated. So other than that, however, the standard doesn't say what needs to happen during that orientation process. So I know that sometimes causes some state offices a little bit of heartburn if they don't think the orientation is as thorough as it should be. But I think that points to the importance of using training and technical assistance to make sure that agencies are providing thorough, comprehensive orientations during that process. But the standard itself doesn't require what that process needs to be, other than it needs to state that the orientation happens within 6 months. We get a lot of questions about what happens if not all board members go through that orientation process. And so this is a more technical question, but board members are volunteers, and so the agency can't force them to go through that orientation process. Although it's important, obviously, for the agencies to make sure they're telling their board members what's going to be expected of them. There are cases of board members not going through the orientation. The agency would not be out of compliance with this standard because they can't force a volunteer to go through that orientation. This standard is there just to make sure that process is in place and that there is a clear point that says it happens within 6 months. But you can't force a board member to go through orientation. So this is a question that's come up on a number of other occasions. I know it does, like I said, sometimes cause some heartburn if you think that the agency, is sort of not sticking with that process. But that is I've talked with CAPLA a number of times about this. And so, that is the interpretation of the standard that they've communicated to me, and I think is sort of the strict interpretation of what 5.7 says. And so, in terms of documentation, you would want to see that written process description, ideally, or at least a narrative description of that process. But again, the standard doesn't require what the content of that orientation process would be, and it doesn't require that board members actually participate in that process. But again, another example of one of those, red flags that might be raised, you could still mark an agency as in compliance with standard 5.7. If you're noticing a lot of board members aren't going through that orientation, that would be a red flag that you would need to follow up with that agency and make sure that the board was oriented and knew what its roles and responsibilities were. So why don't we go into standard 5.9 and then we'll take questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jarl. 5.9, the organization's governing board receives program reports at each regular board meeting. So in ways this is similar to what I was just talking about, because it doesn't say what the programmatic report should look like. It doesn't, there's no template that's given, there's no content, there's nothing. It just says that the board needs to see those, even those programmatic reports, and this so that the board can keep abreast of program development and they can provide input into the process. Now you see in your screen it says this standard is meant to be complex and does not require reporting on all programs at every board meeting. And that is true. It does not say that in the standard. It just says that the board receives program reports on a regular board meeting, so it's not all programs at every board meeting. So I could talk what I say, I could report about Head Start one month, and then I could do a report to the board in the next month, or the next time they meet, about my weatherization program. So we move on to documentation, and we'll see that it says the organizations can determine their own process to report programs to the board. That, again, gives an example like I talk about, may cycle through the program semi-annually, may do on a quarterly basis. The board minutes should reflect that the program reports have been provided and received by the full board, but they could be in writing, so it could be a full narrative report, it could be a graphic, it could be a dashboard, and or it could be presented verbally. So I could go into my board and do a verbal update on Head Start and do a verbal update on my weatherization program. And then the last goal is the program committee of the board is not required, but can be a good place to house through program reviews with summaries coming to the full board. So that might be something that agencies choose to do. I think one of the things here goes along with some other standards we were talking about, was that this might be an opportunity for agencies to improve what their board reports look like. It might be a good place to offer training and technical assistance. Okay, we're going to take a quick pause here. If you have any questions, ask or type them in, because I noticed we're getting close to our ending time. So, Charles, do you want to move into the next standard, which I believe is 6.2?
Sure, and just a quick ad for the partnership YouTube channel. We've got some short videos for boards on the organizational standards, so that's just a good resource for your agencies. So moving on to strategic planning, standard 6.2, which reads, the approved strategic plan addresses reduction of poverty, revitalization of low-income communities, and or empowerment of people with low incomes to become more self-sufficient. And this standard was put in there because we were seeing strategic plans that only had internal agency goals. So the purpose of this standard is to make sure that an agency has both articulated the outcomes that they're going to achieve for the broader community, speaking to one or more of those goals articulated in the standard, and it's perfectly okay if an agency wants to have internal goals, such as improving their financial sustainability or doing, agency trainings, but they need to have both internal and external goals. And then in terms of documentation, it should either be implicit in the goals themselves that they address one or more of those goals. Of course, hopefully the agency has articulated that somewhere in the strategic plan, but the guidance that I would give to agencies, actually for both the strategic plan and the needs assessment, is just to include a compliance section. That would just be one page where they list all the organizational standards that address both of those processes, and to provide a short paragraph that explains how they're in compliance, and then reference the particular part of the needs assessment or strategic plan where a monitor could go just to double check and make sure they're in compliance. So making sure that the monitor doesn't have to go hunt through the needs assessment or the strategic plan, I think is really helpful, and just giving them that guidance to have, just one or two pages of a compliance section, I think will answer some of these questions and I think address, some of these issues in terms of interpretation. I just saw we had a question come in. Why does it have and or empowerment of low-income person to be self-sufficient? This is in the CSBG Act as one of the purposes. So, like I said, the intent of this, and it does list, basically those are the goals right out of the CSBG Act. The intent of this standard is to make sure that agencies are including those external goals that they have for families, for individuals, for the community, and so that was the language used to make sure that strategic plans weren't just internally focused documents, that they weren't just looking at internal agency goals, that they talked about the outcomes that were going to be produced in the community. So that's the reason why it's worded that way. So they just lifted those goals right out of the CSBG Act.
Okay.
6.3?
Well, and absolutely right. That language comes out of 6.2, and 6.3 is a little bit more broad. It just says the plan contains family, agency, and/or community goals, and public. It just adds in that or comparable planning document also needs to contain family, agency, and/or community goals. And you'll realize that and/or is key here. So as a community action agency, I could have an agency goal that I'm going to, invest in a new database system or financial software or whatever that's going to be. And I think as Charles already kind of referenced that with a lot of community action agencies, not necessarily a lot, many community action agencies plan on internal agency goals. This is making sure that there's also those family and community goals as well. So that you documentation, that when you see the strategic plan, obviously you need to be able to see the plan, but that it would have family goals that talks about programs and services, agency development or improvement of staff or something within the organization itself, and community goals could be community improvement and revitalization around community engagement. I've seen many strategic plans where when you see the actual goals in the plan, that the agency will indicate next to the goal whether it's a family level goal or whether it's a community level goal or whether it's an agency goal. So that makes it more. Any questions?
And you were breaking up a little bit there, but I think that that standard also sort of similar to the previous one, having that compliance section in the strategic planning document that just gives the agency, just a paragraph to list how they're in compliance with that standard, just so, if they're just sort of assuming that the monitor can see where they're in compliance, it just makes it a little bit easier, if they just provide that paragraph of explanation and can point to some of those goals that reflect those different ROMA levels.
Okay, so let's move on, Charles. I think we have a couple of slides here, or a couple resource slides.
Yep, and we've got one more question. I thought that the new national goals and MPIs don't have agency any longer, so should they not have to have agency goals? So I think the issue is if an agency has a strategic plan that doesn't have any goals related to the agency itself, I don't think that would be the